infiltration, as well as helping with general stability in your building structure, call us at 713-936-3021 or visit us online at nrgfoam.com for more information. NRG Spray Foam. Building green, living green.
This message was from a proud sponsor to KNLY 91.1 FM.
We are broadcasting live from the Woodlands, Texas to the world. You're listening to the only multimedia FM station in Houston, Texas. Your Fusion Radio. Top 40s, dance, Latin, country, pop, rock and roll. All in one station. Mixing genres and generations. You're listening to KNLY New Waverly, Texas. 91.1 FM, The Boss.
The program presented are submitted by members of our community and are a proud sponsor of KNLY 91.1 FM. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect those of KNLY 91.1 FM and its affiliates.
Good morning and welcome to a very special edition of Today's Entrepreneur I'm your host, Armani Cassel, and joining us today instead of an entrepreneur is U.S. Senate candidate Amanda Edwards.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to begin with your story and how you decided to run for U.S. Senate in Texas.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I'm a native Houstonian Texan, born and raised, and have been part of this journey of public service for quite some time. I went to Eisenhower High School in the Aldine Independent School District, and then went to Emory, went to Harvard for law school, and came back eventually home to start practicing law and to also serve in nonprofit spaces. One of the things that was so important to me early on was understanding the importance of giving back and empowering communities. And so I ran for office in 2015 and got elected to serve as an at-large Houston City Council member. I've been serving in that capacity since. I've gotten a chance to do things like galvanize and really organize our tech and innovation scene. We now have a board that oversees that. We started the task force with recommendations. We've just broken ground on our new innovation district in the city of Houston. I've got a chance to work with small business owners, women and minority and small business owners to try to increase access to capital, try to improve the number of communities through our Complete Communities program. So I've got my hand on a number of things, including Harvey, since I've been in office, but decided to make the leap to run for the United States Senate to unseat John Cornyn after the 2018 election cycle saw that Texas really was in play. And it was time, and I believe it is time, for there to be leaders who are interested in built and able to make transformative differences in people's lives. And so I'm running, wanting to address things like healthcare and expanding access to it, also wanting to address things like expanding access to economic opportunity for all Texans, so that instead of it being an anxiety-producing conversation, it in fact becomes something that people feel included in and see those opportunities become more abundant.
That's an inspiring story. I'm really excited to talk with you about that as well, since I'm a millennial as well, and so it's an interesting and inspiring story. So we'll get to that here in a moment, but I wanted to begin with the story about the Woodlands and how we're consistently ranked in the top 10 places to live in the United States, but there's indications of recession on the horizon. So how would you plan to keep the Woodlands and the surrounding Houston area in that top 10 category?
Absolutely. I mean, people ask me a lot, why did you pick the economy? Why did you pick healthcare? And the reason why, in terms of the bases of my platform, and the basis of that is because I believe that these are issues that people worry about at night. These are the issues that deal with fundamental security in households, families, and communities. And so these are the issues that, to be frank with you, are fundamental. If the economy falls apart, then people's sense of stability falls apart. And so what you want to make sure is that people feel stable feel secure. And those are two of those space points. As it relates to what to do in the event of a downturn, we've seen downturns in our economy before. In 2008, we had a pretty significant one nationwide. We have a little bit of insulation here that is slightly different. It's a little bit counter-cyclical in our area because of the impact of the energy markets. That isn't to say that we are immune from downturns, because certainly we are not. And when the energy markets go down, of course, that has an impact on both Houston, the Woodlands, and also any of the surrounding areas, just simply because of the nature of our economy and the Gulf. And so what we have to make sure is that we're looking at what industries we can continue to diversify into. So when you think about things like energy, are there services that can be provided? I know the Woodlands has been building up quite a bit in terms of satellite offices, headquarters being located there. And so making sure that those industries that are not just those that might be affected with the recession are present and are doing well. Also looking at ways to continue to grow and expand. So one way in which we are doing that, and I would love to see the Woodlands join in, is looking at how we expanded our innovation economy. It's not in to replace or to diminish any other industry that presently exists. It actually enhances existing industry. So if you think back to the number of Fortune 500s that were Fortune 500 companies 50 years ago, the list will get cut in half. And that is because you have to continue to evolve as a company or as a business in order to stay and remain relevant. Well, when you think about startup communities, that helps you to do that. It can help create large companies from within the startup communities, but often they're acquired, their technologies are acquired, they're purchased, businesses are customers of these startups and their technologies, and so they help the business to innovate and survive and continue to evolve and grow. And that's some of the things that we have to continue to be thinking of is, as I like to call it, walking and chewing gum. We're always going to have a crisis in front of us. And so the question is, how do you tackle that and continue to have vision for your region so that your communities can be as viable as possible?
And it's great to hear in terms of reassurance about the recession as well, that we do have some plans just to make sure that we're resilient against that. My other question was about, of course, with the climate and also in the 2-year anniversary of Hurricane Harvey. What are your plans for climate resilience and, unfortunately, with climate change, as it creates an environment where certain storms can be more prone to rapid intensification like Harvey was? What are your plans for Texans as it relates to climate resilience?
Great question. As you know, 2 years ago, Harvey made landfall and, of course, dumped up as high as 51 inches of water onto various parts of our community. And what we saw from that is a focus, at least in the short term, on some things that could be done in the immediate to be more prepared for the next disaster. And unfortunately, I do say the next disaster because Harvey happened to represent a string of 3 500-year flood events that had happened 3 years in a row in this region. And so we will continue as a result of climate change. These conditions will only continue. And so we have to make sure that our residents are better prepared than they were before. Things like looking at making sure that we have the protections in place, like a coastal spine. Those are the kinds of things that we can be building that can safeguard against storm surge, those kinds of conditions, but also making sure our flood mitigation pathways are adequate. There was a Harris County passed like a year after the storm, Harris County passed a bond election that helped to provide some seed funding for flood mitigation efforts, but it was not nearly enough given the grand nature of the issue. A lot of what we saw, there was a price tag, I think the Harris County Flood Control District put out there in terms of how much it would cost to get our flood mitigation channels in order to withstand more flooding, and they said it would cost about $35 billion. Well, that would be if you were due to do so at the 100-year flood level in terms of capacity. We are having 500-year floods and storms, and so we've got to see a much more meaningful amount placed into investing in our flood mitigation channels. You've got to see your streets and drainage work properly so that it can flow into the flood mitigation channels. And then we've got to think about how to think about our green space. Green space is going to become more and more important. If you are familiar with our Bayou Greenways initiative that we did in Houston, we tried to reverse course on a number of bad decisions that had been made in the past to pour concrete over our flood mitigation channels, which we now know is not the wise thing to do. And we've got to see our communities become more green. I know the Woodlands has that down pat, but even there, you see people, the temptation to overdevelop is something of concern as well. And so we've got to think about our development patterns, where we're developing. Have we created enough drainage and enough opportunity for there to be detention for rainwaters and the like? And we've got to continue to make sure that we're not developing in a way that removes any of the all of the porous lands and properties and space, but instead we're just replacing it with concrete. We've got to make sure we've got the appropriate balance. So these are things we have to be mindful of. Of course, we need to be mindful of what's happening to create these conditions in the first place from a climate change standpoint, and then we've got to try to get more prepared, because as is the case and has been the case, we're seeing these types of events and storms recur and occur and occur again.
Right, and I'm glad to hear about your plans for that as well, in terms of both for Houston and the Woodlands being able to be climate change resilient in this part of Texas. It's very important. And I wanted to get back to that question I mentioned here in the beginning about younger generations staying involved in politics. That I'm a millennial, and you mentioned you're a millennial as well. And how would you get, I know that your story is very inspirational to a lot of people, especially the younger generation. Can you tell us more about how millennials and Gen Z can stay involved and be involved in politics?
Absolutely. It's a matter of being involved in your community. It's quite simple in terms of getting engaged. If you're looking at some of the presidential candidates, watch the debates that you're seeing come on TV, look at their platform, see what they represent. People can join Democratic or Republican or independent clubs, whatever their political persuasion, but joining clubs, learning more, joining your civic clubs will help you on a more local level become more astute to some of the local challenges that your communities might be facing. So you can get involved in a civic sense in terms of neighborhoods and that type of civic engagement, or you can get involved in the political sense. Whatever you do, you always want to make sure that you're registered to vote. That's really, really important, and it's not something that everyone internalizes. So making sure that you are properly registered to vote. But then in addition to that, making sure you're educating yourself, sharing that information with your contacts, not making assumptions that everybody around you is as interested. Don't mistake social media activism for being engaged or prepared to be a part of the electorate. You have to be registered, and you have to participate either by going and finding your appropriate voting location on election day, or, as I recommend for people, always to vote early. But never let that just be the beginning and end of your process. The next step is to making sure the stuff you wanted and the stuff you heard people promise you, they've got to deliver on that. And so hosting forums, hosting events, you'd be surprised at the things that candidates will go to, and elected officials. Once they're in office, they should be attending those events and forums and the like as well. It's about creating a system of accountability so that you can actually get the results that you talk about when people are on the campaign trail. That's critically important. That's actually what our campaign is trying to do, is to really create a movement of people who are now seeking to be empowered in this way in terms of demanding the results that they've heard their politicians talk about. Now it's time to deliver those results, which is why I am running. I believe people deserve more than the empty promises and the lip service. They deserve people who are capable, competent, and who will deliver the results that are necessary in their lives.
That's an excellent point, and I'm grateful for that example that you serve to both to the youth and the multiple generations of people who are interested in politics and want to stay involved, and as well as I had an extra question as well for people who want to run for office. What's your advice for both the younger generation, millennials, Gen Z, who would want to consider running?
Yeah, I think first you've got to answer the question for yourself is why you want to run. I think that's the first question most candidates get asked, and I think it's the first one you need to ask yourself when making a determination if you should run. And if it has something to just, you go through a list of the reasons you want to run and you don't see community on that list or the people you're seeking to serve as being number one on that list, then that may not be what you should be doing. I think what has to happen when you're in a servant position like this, a servant leadership position, if you're going to be good at this, you've really got to connect with people and the issues that matter to them. And that's why you have to be there. It's a commitment and a fight. My personal example, when I was growing up, my dad had cancer. And so when I was watching him go through treatments and get transplants and this and this and that, I was asking questions about who was paying for it, how insurance worked, what happened if they said no. And at that point, I realized that healthcare and this whole healthcare system thing is a really, really important issue, and that this is more than just politics and the question about what size you want your government to be. This is something that really relates to life or death for so many families. And so for me, my personal why related to having somebody in office who could be serious, understand the urgency of the issues impacting people, like access to health care. And so for me, my personal purpose also relates to wanting to empower and equip people with the tools that they need in order to get the things that they want that better their community, but also just to improve the overall circumstances people are facing. So I see myself as a problem solver, as somebody who has vision, who is really fulfilled by seeing those results come down the pipeline for people. And so that's my personal motivation. And so identifying, if you are someone who's interested, what your personal motivation is, what is it that you want to do for the community, and then connecting the dots. Why are you the best person to do the job? So it isn't enough just to say you want to do these things if you don't have the skill sets. So you've got to be putting yourself in positions where you gain the skill sets. I happen to have been a lawyer practicing law for a long time and working in communities, building schools, building hospitals, things that help enhance communities. That's part of my background. I also was part of a community building and social change fellowship when I was in school. And so I have those community building skills as a part of my background. So those things help me in terms of understanding communities and how they work, how to engage them, and then most importantly, how to close a deal or achieve results for people. Because a lot of people are well intentioned, but they may not know how to get things done, and that comes over time. And so I would encourage those young folks out there who are looking at doing something like this, answer those questions that I mentioned. Why? Who would you want to impact? How would you do it? But then that last question of why should somebody support you to do it? And having that passion isn't quite enough. You've got to have the passion and the skills. So looking at internships that you can do, working on a campaign, getting to know those communities, serving on nonprofit boards. Those are all ways that you can be really, gearing up to get the skill sets that will be needed for you to actually have the impact that you are seeking to have on the community. And that's the advice I'd give any young person or other age, to be frank with you, in terms of running for office. The other one is seeking out mentorship, talking to people who've done this before, but not to be alarmed if you don't find a lot of mentors out there. Don't let that stop you. But do have conversations with office holders. A number of us will have conversations with people when they reach out to us because we know what it feels like to be on the other side of that conversation.
That's excellent advice, and you're an excellent example of color as well for people of color. So it's very, very great to have you on this show for today's entrepreneurs. And again, it's Amanda Edwards, U.S. Senate candidate for U.S. Senate, and we're very glad to have you on our show.
Thank you so much for having me and for creating this platform.
Thank you, and have a great day. This is Armani Cassel for today's entrepreneurs.
Thank you.